Welcome back to another slow and slightly confusing chapter of history. Tonight, you're standing in the middle of what was once America's most promising frontier, watching the sky turn black at 2 in the afternoon. The wind howls across endless flatland, carrying with it the dreams of a generation, literally. Every grain of soil whipping past your face once anchored the roots of native buffalo grass, and before that it cradled the hopes of farmers who thought they could tame the Great Plains with nothing but steel plows and stubborn determination. You're about to live through the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, and honestly, you probably won't survive this. Not because I'm being dramatic, but because 1 in 4 people who stayed in the worst hit areas either died from dust pneumonia or packed up everything they owned and fled west, like their lives depended on it, which they did. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Are you drifting off in London at midnight, fighting insomnia in Tokyo at 3 a.m.? Or maybe you're perfectly synchronized with me here in the States, ready to learn about one of the most catastrophic man-made environmental disasters in American history. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's 1931, and you're living in what locals call next year country, because next year the rains will surely come. Next year the wheat will grow tall and golden again. Next year you'll finally pay off that mortgage on the 160 acres you claimed under the Homestead Act. But as you stand in your doorway, watching another wall of dust approach from the western horizon, you're starting to wonder if next year will ever come. The irony is almost laughable if you weren't choking on airborne Kansas. Just a decade ago, the same land was so wet and productive that people called it America's breadbasket. Farmers were making money, hand over fist, wheat prices were through the roof, thanks to World War I, and everyone from New York bankers to small-town grocers was buying up prairie land like it was guaranteed gold. The rain fell so regularly in the 1920s that old-timers started believing the popular myth that rain follows the plow, that human cultivation actually encouraged precipitation. Your neighbors, the Hendersons, bought their spread in 1925 without ever seeing it. They just looked at a map, mailed a check to a land agent, and figured they'd struck it rich. Mrs. Henderson used to joke that farming was so easy out here, the wheat practically planted itself. She's not joking anymore. Last month, she found 3 feet of sand piled against her kitchen window, and her husband hasn't seen his prize bull in 6 days. It's probably buried somewhere in the back 40. The transformation happened so gradually that nobody saw it coming. First, the spring rains of 1930 were a little late. Then 1931 brought less moisture than usual. By 1932, the drought had settled in like an unwelcome houseguest who decided to stay forever. But here's the thing that makes this story particularly tragic. The drought alone wouldn't have created the Dust Bowl. It was the combination of natural climate patterns and human choices that turned a bad situation into an epic disaster. Historians still argue whether the farmers of the 1920s could have reasonably predicted what would happen when they stripped away millions of acres of native grassland. The science of soil conservation barely existed back then, and the financial incentives to plow up every available acre were overwhelming. Wheat was selling for over $1 a bushel, serious money in those days, and the government was practically giving away land to anyone willing to cultivate it. But you're not thinking about government policy or economic incentives as you watch this latest dust storm approach. You're thinking about survival, about whether you have enough water stored to last another week, about whether your youngest daughter's cough is getting worse, about whether the chickens you moved into the kitchen last night are still alive. The wind picks up, and you can taste the electricity in the air, literally. These dust storms carry so much static charge that you've learned to drag a chain behind your truck to ground the electrical buildup. Yesterday, your neighbor got shocked so badly trying to shake hands that he was knocked unconscious for 5 minutes. The dust particles rub against each other in the air, creating electrical fields that can measure in the hundreds of thousands of volts. You step back inside and close the door, but it won't matter. The dust will find its way in anyway, through cracks you didn't know existed around windows, you sealed with wet towels under doors, you've stuffed with rags. By morning, there will be small dunes of fine brown powder on your kitchen table, your bed, your children's toys. Everything will taste like dirt for weeks. Welcome to the Dust Bowl, where the American dream got buried under billions of tons of topsoil, and where you're about to learn that sometimes the land fights back. You grip the wooden handles of your steel plow, feeling the satisfying resistance as the blade cuts through soil that hasn't been disturbed in thousands of years. It's 1928, and you're living the American dream one furrow at a time. The invention you're wielding, John Deere's revolutionary steel plow from 1837, has transformed farming across the Great Plains, but you have no idea you're holding a weapon of mass destruction. The prairie grass beneath your feet tells a story that goes back millions of years. Buffalo grass, blue grama, and dozens of other native species have woven their roots into an underground network so complex that scientists are still mapping it today. Some of these root systems extend down 15 feet, creating a living carpet that can withstand droughts, floods, fires, and the thundering hooves of 60 million bison. But they can't withstand your plow. As you work, you're joined by thousands of other farmers across the southern Great Plains, all of them caught up in the same wheat fever that's gripping the nation. The Homestead Act of 1862 promised 160 acres to anyone willing to prove up the land by building a house and cultivating crops for 5 years. By the 1920s, that policy has unleashed an army of amateur farmers onto an ecosystem that took millennia to establish. Your neighbor Tom McAllister bought his land through a newspaper advertisement. He'd never farmed a day in his life. He was a bookkeeper from Cleveland who figured farming couldn't be much harder than balancing ledgers. The land company that sold him his plot had convinced him that the recent wet years represented the new normal for the high plains. Rain follows the plow, they told him, repeating the folk wisdom that had become gospel among prairie settlers. The economics make perfect sense from your perspective. Wheat is selling for $1.50 a bushel, and you can grow 20 bushels per acre on good land. Do the math, and you're looking at $30 per acre in gross income, more money than most people see in a year. The steel plow you're using can turn over an acre in a single day compared to the week it would have taken with older wooden plows that broke against the tough prairie sod. But here's what you don't know. Every acre you plow destroys a carbon sink that took centuries to develop. The native grasses store massive amounts of carbon in their root systems, and when you break that sod, you're releasing stored carbon into the atmosphere while simultaneously removing the vegetation that would normally absorb it. Modern climate scientists estimate that prairie conversion released as much carbon as several decades of industrial emissions. Historians still argue whether the farmers of the 1920s were victims of circumstance or agents of environmental destruction. The truth is probably both. You're making rational economic decisions based on the information available to you, but that information is catastrophically incomplete. The weather records you're relying on only go back about 50 years, and those happened to be relatively wet decades. You have no way of knowing that the Great Plains naturally cycle through extended dry periods that can last decades. The farming techniques you're using would work fine in Ohio or Illinois, where your grandfather successfully grew wheat for 40 years. But the Great Plains aren't Ohio. The annual rainfall here averages 14 inches compared to 37 inches back east. The soil is different, thinner, more alkaline, more prone to erosion. The wind patterns are different, stronger, and more consistent, especially during the spring months when your newly planted wheat is most vulnerable. You're also farming during what meteorologists now recognize as an unusually wet period. The 1920s brought above average rainfall to the Great Plains, creating the illusion that this marginal land had somehow become permanently productive. Soil samples from that era show moisture levels that wouldn't be seen again until the 1970s. You're essentially gambling on weather patterns that are statistical anomalies. The land speculation bubble makes everything worse. Eastern investors who've never seen a prairie are buying up farmland based on inflated crop reports and promotional materials that describe the Great Plains as America's Garden of Eden. By 1929, land that sold for $3 an acre in 1900 is going for $30 an acre. Farmers who bought high are under enormous pressure to maximize their yields, which means plowing up every available acre, including marginal land that should have stayed in grass. Your farming methods are improving each year, but in ways that will soon prove disastrous. The new gasoline-powered tractors can plow faster and deeper than horses ever could. The combination of steel plows and mechanized farming means you can strip the native vegetation from vast areas in a matter of days. What took the original prairie ecosystem centuries to establish, you can destroy in a single growing season. The most dangerous innovation is the practice of summer fallowing, leaving plowed fields bare during the off-season to conserve moisture for the next year's crop. This technique works in more humid climates, but on the windy Great Plains, it creates millions of acres of loose, exposed soil, just waiting for the right weather conditions to take flight. You notice that dust storms are becoming more common, but they seem like a minor inconvenience compared to the profits you're making. Everyone deals with a little dust out here. It's just part of prairie life. The old-timers warn you about black blizzards they remember from their childhood, but those stories seem like ancient history compared to the prosperity all around you. As you finish plowing your section and head home for supper, you're satisfied with a good day's work. You've turned over 20 acres of virgin prairie, and next spring you'll plant it all to wheat. The mortgage payment is due in 6 months, but at current prices, you'll make enough from this year's harvest to pay it off completely and maybe even buy that new combine you've been eyeing. You have no idea that you've just helped set the stage for one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. The roots you severed today were holding together soil that will soon travel from your farm to Washington, D.C. The grass you destroyed was the only thing standing between your family and catastrophe. But tonight, you sleep well, dreaming of golden wheat fields stretching to the horizon. You wake up on a March morning in 1932 to an eerie silence that makes your skin crawl. No birdsong, no rustling of wind through wheat stalks, just dead, oppressive quiet hanging over your farm like a funeral shroud. When you step outside to check your fields, you discover why there are no wheat stalks to rustle. What should be green shoots reaching toward the spring sun is instead a wasteland of brown stubble and cracked earth that crunches under your boots like broken glass. The drought that will define the next decade has arrived with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, but it took you months to realize what was happening. Weather patterns don't announce themselves with fanfare. They creep in slowly, one missed rainfall at a time, until suddenly you're living in a different climate entirely. The winter of 1931-1932 brought almost no snow, and the spring rains that usually arrive in April never came. May passed without precipitation. June brought nothing but hot, dry winds that seemed to suck the remaining moisture right out of the ground. What you're experiencing is the result of massive atmospheric changes happening thousands of miles away. The North Atlantic Ocean has been warming gradually throughout the 1920s, creating what meteorologists call an anomalous sea surface temperature pattern. This warming shifts the position of high-pressure systems that normally guide moisture-bearing storms across the continent. Instead of rain clouds following their usual path over the Great Plains, they're being deflected north and south, leaving you stranded in a meteorological dead zone. The jet stream, that river of fast-moving air 6 miles above your head, has locked into a pattern that spells doom for your region. A massive ridge of high pressure has parked itself over the central United States like a giant atmospheric cork, blocking storm systems that would normally bring rain to the Great Plains. This ridge is so strong and persistent that it's redirecting the normal flow of moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, sending it east toward the Atlantic instead of north toward your farm. Your neighbor Pete Henderson has started carrying a rain gauge everywhere he goes, checking it obsessively 3 times a day, even though it's been bone dry for weeks. His wife jokes that he's losing his mind, but you understand the impulse. When your entire livelihood depends on precipitation, every cloud becomes a source of hope, and every clear sky feels like a personal insult from the weather gods. The psychological impact of drought is something nobody talks about, but you're living it every day. There's a peculiar form of madness that comes from watching the sky, constantly reading omens in cloud formations that dissipate before they can produce a single drop of rain. You've started having dreams about thunderstorms, so vivid that you wake up expecting to find puddles, only to discover the same merciless blue sky stretching from horizon to horizon. Historians still argue whether the farmers of the early 1930s should have recognized the signs of long-term climate shift sooner. The weather records available to you suggest that droughts this severe occur about once every 50 years, but those records only go back to the 1870s, barely a blink of an eye in geological terms. Tree ring studies conducted decades later would reveal that the Great Plains experience mega droughts lasting 20 to 40 years on a roughly cyclical basis, but that information won't be available until long after your farm has blown away. The cruel irony is that this drought follows the wettest decade in recorded Great Plains history. The 1920s brought so much rain that many farmers became convinced the climate had permanently shifted toward greater moisture. Agricultural extension agents were actually recommending that farmers plant crops traditionally suited to more humid regions. The government issued pamphlets encouraging settlement in areas that had previously been considered too dry for agriculture. You're not alone in your confusion about what's happening. The newly formed Weather Bureau doesn't yet have the tools to understand large-scale climate patterns. They can forecast weather a few days in advance, but the concept of seasonal or multi-year climate prediction won't exist for another 50 years. The scientists trying to make sense of the drought are working with surface observations from scattered weather stations completely unaware of the ocean temperature patterns and upper atmospheric dynamics that drive long-term weather patterns. The absence of rain becomes its own presence in your daily life. You find yourself planning activities around the faint possibility of precipitation, postponing trips to town when distant clouds appear on the horizon, only to watch them dissolve into nothing by afternoon. Your wife has started saving every drop of water from cooking and cleaning, storing it in mason jars, lined up on the kitchen counter like liquid hope. Your wheat crop tells the story of the drought in stages. First, the young plants simply stopped growing their bright green color, fading to a sickly yellow-brown. Then they began to wilt, despite your best efforts at conservation. Finally, they gave up entirely, leaving behind brittle stalks that snap off at ground level when you walk through the field. Each broken stem represents dollars you'll never earn and debts you can't repay. The most unsettling aspect of the drought is how it transforms familiar landscapes into alien terrain. Fields that were lush and productive just 2 years ago now look like moonscapes. Ponds that held water year-round have cracked into geometric patterns that look almost decorative from a distance. Even the tumbleweeds seem listless, too dried out to roll properly in the wind. Local wildlife tells its own story of environmental collapse. The prairie dogs have abandoned their towns, leaving behind empty holes that dot the landscape like bullet wounds. Birds that normally nest in the area have simply disappeared following some instinct that told them this place was no longer capable of supporting life. Even the insects seem fewer, as if they've collectively decided to wait out whatever catastrophe is approaching. As you walk back toward your house, you notice something that makes your blood run cold. Dust devils spinning across your neighbor's freshly plowed field. These miniature tornadoes are picking up loose soil and carrying it hundreds of feet into the air before depositing it miles away. You've seen dust devils before, but never so many and never so large. Something in your farmer's intuition tells you this is just the beginning. The drought has arrived, but the real disaster is still building on the horizon, waiting for the right combination of wind and desperation to unleash itself across the Great Plains. You're chopping firewood behind your barn on January 21st, 1932, when something makes you pause and look toward the western horizon. At first, you think it's just an unusual cloud formation, a dark line stretching across the sky like someone drew it with charcoal. But clouds don't move that fast, and they certainly don't roll forward like a massive ocean wave frozen in mid-crash. What you're seeing defies every natural law you thought you understood about weather. The temperature has been dropping all morning as a powerful cold front pushes down from Canada, but now the wind is picking up in a way that makes your skin crawl. It starts as a whisper, then builds to a moan, then escalates to a howl that drowns out your own thoughts. Your chickens sense something wrong and huddle together in their coop, making distressed noises you've never heard before. Even your old dog Rex whimpers and presses against your legs, seeking comfort from whatever primal threat he can smell in the air. The wall of darkness on the horizon isn't moving like a normal storm. It's advancing with mechanical precision, maintaining its shape and density as it devours the landscape mile by mile. You estimate it's at least 50 miles wide, and this is the part that makes your knees weak, nearly 2 miles high. The top of this thing disappears into the sky like a vertical cliff made of roiling brown-black clouds. No storm you've ever witnessed has looked remotely like this. What you're seeing is the first great dust storm of the Dust Bowl era, though you won't know its historical significance for years to come. The meteorological conditions creating this monster are almost impossibly perfect for disaster, a strong surface low-pressure system racing eastward from Colorado, trailing a cold front with winds gusting over 60 miles per hour. The front is moving across millions of acres of recently plowed farmland where native grasses once held the soil together with root systems that took centuries to develop. Behind you, your neighbor Tom comes running from his house, his wife Mary close behind. "What in God's name is that thing?" Tom shouts over the increasing wind. Mary is clutching their baby daughter against her chest, her eyes wide with the kind of fear usually reserved for house fires or approaching tornadoes. But this isn't a tornado, it's something entirely outside everyone's experience, a phenomenon so unprecedented that there's no established protocol for survival. The advancing wall of dust creates its own weather systems as it moves. You can see horizontal rotation within the cloud like enormous invisible cylinders spinning just above the ground. This is what meteorologists call horizontal vorticity. The dust cloud is literally rolling forward, picking up more soil with each revolution and growing larger as it travels. The physics are actually elegant. The wedge shape of the cold front creates wind shear that generates these rolling motions, allowing the storm to maintain its structure across hundreds of miles. You have perhaps 30 minutes before the storm reaches your farm, and you're quickly learning that preparation for something like this is mostly psychological. Tom runs back to his house to cover his well and bring livestock into the barn. Mary starts gathering wet towels and bed sheets. Someone told her once that damp cloth can help filter the fine dust particles, though no one really knows if that's true. These are the kinds of folk remedies people invent when facing the unknown. The most unnerving aspect of watching the storm approach is the silence that precedes it. As the wall of dust draws closer, it seems to absorb all sound from the landscape ahead of it. Birds stop singing, insects fall silent. Even the wind noise diminishes to an eerie whisper. It's as if the storm creates a bubble of dead air immediately in front of itself, a zone of supernatural quiet that serves as its herald. Historians still argue Whether this first great dust storm of 1932 was truly unprecedented or simply the largest in living memory. Native American oral traditions from the region include stories of black blizzards that could last for days, suggesting that massive dust storms have occurred before on the Great Plains. But those stories describe natural phenomena occurring on virgin prairie, not the man-made disaster. You're witnessing the direct result of stripping protective vegetation from millions of acres. The storm's approach triggers strange atmospheric effects that seem almost supernatural. Static electricity builds in the air until your hair literally stands on end. Metal objects begin to spark when touched. The family cat hisses and runs for cover, its fur standing out, like it's been rubbed with a balloon. Some farmers later report seeing actual lightning flickering within the dust cloud itself, though whether this is real electrical activity or an optical illusion remains debated. You retreat into your house and begin the now familiar ritual of sealing cracks and openings. Wet towels get stuffed under doors. Windows are covered with damp sheets. The chimney flue gets closed and weighted down. Your wife fills every available container with water, knowing that once the storm hits, you won't be able to see well enough to find the pump handle. Your children huddle together on the couch, sensing the adult's fear without fully understanding its source. When the storm finally reaches your property, the transformation is instantaneous and complete. Day becomes night in the space of a heartbeat. The temperature drops 20 degrees as the sun disappears behind billions of tons of airborne soil. The wind doesn't just blow, it screams, carrying with it the detritus of 1,000 farms, topsoil from Kansas, wheat stubble from Nebraska, even fragments of buildings from settlements unlucky enough to lie in the storm's direct path. The sound is indescribable. Imagine a freight train passing inches from your head while someone runs their fingernails down the world's largest chalkboard. The house shakes on its foundation as wind-driven particles sandblast the exterior walls. Through the windows, you can see absolutely nothing. Even with your face pressed against the glass, visibility extends perhaps 6 inches into a brown void that seems to swallow light itself. Inside your sealed house, fine dust begins appearing anyway, sifting through cracks you didn't know existed. It gets into your eyes, your nose, your mouth. Every breath tastes like dirt. Your throat feels raw within minutes. The baby starts coughing a dry hacking sound that will become the unofficial soundtrack of the Dust Bowl years. The storm passes over your farm in about 4 hours, but it feels like days. When the wall of dust finally moves on toward the east, you emerge into an alien landscape. Everything your barn, your fences, your truck, is buried under drifts of fine brown powder. But more disturbing than the accumulated dust is what's missing. Your neighbor's chicken coop has simply vanished along with most of his topsoil and about half of his wheat field. You don't know it yet, but you've just witnessed the opening act of America's greatest environmental disaster. You've learned to live like a miner in your own home, and it's only been 6 months since that first great dust storm. Every morning you wake up to find a thin layer of grit covering everything: your pillow, your coffee cup, the baby's toys. The dust isn't just on things, it's in things. You open your kitchen cabinet and find dirt inside sealed mason jars. You check your bedroom dresser and discover sand between folded clothes that haven't been touched in weeks. The dust has a malevolent intelligence finding its way through barriers that should be impenetrable. Your daily routine now revolves around dust management in ways that would seem absurd to anyone living in a normal climate. You wet down towels every morning and hang them over doorways, creating makeshift airlocks between rooms. Your wife has taken to covering the dinner table with a damp sheet between meals, and even then you crunch sand between your teeth with every bite. The children have learned to sleep with wet handkerchiefs over their faces, and their morning coughing fits have become as regular as sunrise. The fine particles that infiltrate your home aren't just annoying, they're dangerous. This isn't beach sand or the coarse dirt from a garden. These are microscopic fragments of topsoil that have been pulverized by hundreds of miles of wind-driven travel. When you breathe this dust, it penetrates deep into your lungs, creating a condition doctors are starting to call dust pneumonia. Your neighbor's wife, Sarah Mitchell, developed a cough in March that simply never went away. By July, she was coughing up mud-colored phlegm, and by September, she was dead. The electrostatic properties of these dust storms have turned your world into a giant science experiment that nobody asked to participate in. During the worst storms, the air becomes so charged with static electricity that you can't touch anything metal without receiving a shock violent enough to knock you down. Your truck needs a chain dragging behind it to discharge the electrical buildup, and even then, getting out of the vehicle can produce sparks visible in broad daylight. Children learn to avoid metal playground equipment entirely after several kids get shocked unconscious trying to use the monkey bars during dust storm season. Historians still argue whether the psychological effects of constant dust exposure were as damaging as the physical ones. Living under perpetual siege by the environment creates a peculiar form of madness. You find yourself checking the western horizon, obsessively looking for the telltale brown smudge that signals another approaching storm. Sleep becomes elusive because dust storms often arrive at night, and you never know when you'll wake up gasping for air in a house filled with choking particles. The social dynamics of dust storm survival have created new forms of community cooperation that feel almost medieval. When someone spots an approaching storm, word spreads from farm to farm through a network of hand signals and improvised warning systems. Your neighbor Tom has rigged up a bell that he rings when he sees dust on the horizon, and that bell gets taken up by the next farm, and the next, creating a chain of warning that can alert an entire township in minutes. Everyone drops whatever they're doing and begins the frantic process of securing livestock, covering wells, and sealing buildings. Your livestock require constant protection that borders on the absurd. Chickens have to be brought inside during dust storms, or they'll suffocate standing up, their beaks and nostrils clogged with particles too fine to clear naturally. You've moved your milk cow into what used to be the parlor because the barn doesn't seal well enough to keep her breathing clear. The poor animal seems to understand the routine now, walking inside whenever the wind picks up and the sky starts to darken. Even she's learned to read the weather signs that mean survival. The dust transforms ordinary household activities into epic struggles. Cooking becomes an exercise in futility because every surface gets contaminated before you can serve the food. Your wife has taken to preparing meals under a canvas tent. She's rigged up in the kitchen, creating a miniature clean room that works for about 30 minutes before dust finds its way inside. Laundry is impossible During storm season, clothes hung outside to dry come back dirtier than when they went out, and indoor drying just spreads more particles through the house. Personal hygiene becomes a luxury you can barely afford. Water is too precious to waste on frequent bathing, and soap doesn't work effectively when every surface is coated with dust anyway. You've learned to live with a permanent layer of grime that no amount of scrubbing can completely remove. Your hands are permanently stained brown, your fingernails packed with dirt that won't come clean. The children look like street urchins from a Dickens novel, their faces streaked with mud made from dust and tears. The most insidious aspect of Dust Bowl living is how it warps your perception of normal weather. A day without visible dust in the air now feels miraculously clear, even if the sky is overcast and threatening rain. You've become so accustomed to breathing particles that clean air actually feels thin and unsatisfying, like you're not getting enough oxygen. Rain, when it comes, initially makes everything worse by turning the accumulated dust into slippery mud that coats every surface with a layer of slime that's somehow more offensive than the dry dust. Sleep is constantly interrupted by what you've started calling dust attacks, sudden episodes where particles infiltrate your sealed bedroom and you wake up choking and gasping for air. You've learned to keep a jar of water and a damp cloth next to your bed for these emergencies. The children have nightmares about being buried alive, which isn't really metaphorical considering how many neighbors have found their livestock suffocated under dust drifts. Your house has become a fortress under siege with barriers and defenses that would look familiar to anyone who's lived through a war. Wet towels hang over every window and door. Buckets of water sit in every room ready to dampen cloth for emergency breathing filters. You've developed evacuation procedures for the worst storms, designating the interior closet as a safe room where the family can wait out the most severe dust episodes. The strangest adaptation is how you've learned to navigate by sound during the worst storms. When visibility drops to zero and you can't see your own feet, you rely on familiar noises to orient yourself: the creak of the porch step, the rattle of the loose barn door, the distinctive whistle the wind makes through the gap in your fence. You've memorized the acoustic landscape of your property because your eyes have become useless during the storms that now define your existence. You're working in your kitchen garden on May 9th, 1934, when your neighbor Pete comes running across the field, waving his arms and shouting something you can't quite hear over the wind. When he reaches your fence, he's gasping for breath and pointing frantically toward the northwest horizon. "Look," he screams, and when you turn to follow his gaze, your blood turns to ice water. Rising from the prairie, like a mountain range made of malevolent darkness, is the largest dust storm any human being has ever witnessed. This isn't like the routine dust storms you've learned to endure over the past 2 years. This monster stretches from horizon to horizon, its peak disappearing into the stratosphere somewhere around 20,000 feet, roughly twice the height of Mount Everest. The storm front is so massive that it creates its own weather system, with lightning flickering deep within the brown-black clouds, and an ominous rumbling that sounds like the earth itself is groaning in protest. What you're witnessing is the result of the worst possible meteorological conditions converging over the most damaged landscape in American history. A massive low-pressure system has developed over Alberta, Canada, dragging behind it a cold front with winds exceeding 70 miles per hour. This Arctic air mass is racing southeastward across the Great Plains, encountering millions of acres of drought-stricken farmland where protective vegetation has been stripped away by 3 years of failed crops and continued plowing. The physics of what's happening are almost incomprehensible in scale. Conservative estimates suggest this single storm will lift over 350 million tons of topsoil into the atmosphere soil that represents thousands of years of prairie ecosystem development now being redistributed across half the continent in a matter of hours. That's roughly equivalent to moving the entire state of Rhode Island one shovelful at a time and throwing it into the sky. Your wife Martha appears at the kitchen door, takes one look at the approaching apocalypse, and immediately begins the now familiar disaster routine. She starts filling every available container with water while you run to secure the livestock. Your 12-year-old son Billy helps you drive the cattle into the barn, though the animals are already showing signs of panic, their instincts warning them of something beyond normal weather patterns. Even your old horse Buster, who's seen every kind of prairie storm, is trembling and refusing to be led. The storm's approach creates atmospheric effects that feel supernatural. The air pressure drops so dramatically that your ears pop repeatedly, and the static electricity building in the atmosphere makes your hair stand on end despite the heavy wind. Metal objects begin sparking spontaneously. Your wife's wedding ring gives her a shock so severe that she yelps and instinctively throws it across the room, thinking she's been bitten by something. Historians still argue whether this particular storm, which will become known as Black Sunday, was truly unprecedented in the geological history of the Great Plains, or simply the largest dust storm to occur during the era of systematic weather observation. Native American oral traditions include references to legendary dust storms that lasted for weeks, but those accounts describe natural phenomena occurring on intact prairie ecosystems, not the man-made disaster you're about to experience. As the wall of dust draws closer, you can make out details that defy rational explanation. The front edge of the storm isn't smooth, it's turbulent and chaotic, with massive dust devils spinning within the larger structure, like tornadoes made of earth. You can actually see individual farm buildings being scoured clean by the abrasive wind, their paint and siding stripped away in real time. A neighbor's windmill disappears entirely, not blown down, but literally sandblasted into non-existence. The speed of the storm's advance is terrifying in its relentlessness. What started as a distant smudge on the horizon 30 minutes ago is now a towering wall of darkness that blocks out the sun and creates an artificial twilight at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The temperature drops 30 degrees in 10 minutes as the storm's shadow falls across your farm. Your thermometer reads 85 degrees Fahrenheit when you start sealing the house, and 55 degrees by the time you finish. When the storm finally reaches your property, the transformation is beyond anything you've experienced before. Complete darkness falls in seconds, not the gradual dimming of evening, but an instantaneous plunge into night, so absolute that you can't see your own hands. The noise is indescribable. Imagine standing inside a tornado while someone operates a giant grinding machine. The house doesn't just shake, it flexes and groans as if it might come apart at the joints. But this storm is different from the ones you've survived before. In a crucial way, it doesn't pass over and move on. It stalls directly overhead, trapping your family in a brown hell that seems to have no end. Hours pass in complete darkness, punctuated only by the occasional flash of static electricity arcing between metal objects. The dust infiltration is so severe that breathing becomes a conscious effort, requiring wet cloth pressed tightly over your nose and mouth. The psychological impact of being trapped in absolute darkness while the world outside tries to tear itself apart is something no amount of previous experience can prepare you for. Your youngest daughter, 5-year-old Amy, develops what you'll later recognize as the first symptoms of shell shock, rocking back and forth and whimpering softly whenever the wind noise intensifies. Even Billy, who's been through dozens of dust storms, starts crying when he realizes this one isn't going to end quickly. What you don't know, what you can't know, is that this storm is carrying your farm eastward one particle at a time. Soil from your wheat field is traveling at 60 miles per hour toward Chicago, where it will cloud the sky and coat downtown buildings with a fine layer of Kansas dirt. Some of your topsoil will reach as far as New York City, where Wall Street bankers will step outside their offices to find their shoes covered with dust from farms they've never seen but helped destroy through agricultural speculation. The storm finally begins to weaken after 14 hours. But when you emerge from your sealed house the next morning, you're looking at an alien landscape. Snow fences that stood 8 feet tall are now buried to their tops. Your barn is half buried, with only the roof peak visible above a massive drift of pulverized earth. Most shocking of all, your neighbor Tom's farmhouse has simply vanished, leaving behind only a foundation filled with sand like a massive concrete sandbox. You don't know it yet, but while you were cowering in your kitchen, this storm was making headlines in newspapers from Chicago to Washington, D.C. For the first time, the urban East Coast is getting a visceral taste of what's been happening in the Great Plains, and the political implications will reshape American agricultural policy for generations to come. You're standing in your kitchen holding a letter from your brother-in-law in California, and the words on the page might as well be written in gold ink. Come west, he writes. They're hiring fruit pickers in the San Joaquin Valley, and the children can go to school without breathing dust. The letter arrived yesterday, carried by a postal worker who apologized for the delay. Apparently the mail truck got stuck in a dust drift outside town, and they had to dig it out with shovels. It's September 1934, and you're facing the decision that's tearing apart communities across the southern Great Plains. Stay and fight the drought, or join the largest internal migration in American history. Around your kitchen table, the same conversation is happening in thousands of farmhouses, sometimes ending in bitter arguments that split families permanently. Your wife Martha wants to leave immediately. Your teenage son Billy refuses to abandon the farm his grandfather homesteaded. You're caught in the middle, watching your neighbors make choices that will define the rest of their lives. The Hendersons next door made their decision 3 weeks ago. You watched them load everything they owned into a battered 1928 Ford truck, furniture, clothing, farm tools, and 3 children under the age of 10. Mrs. Henderson cried as they drove away, not because she was sad to leave, but because she was terrified of what they might find in California. The newspapers are full of stories about Dust Bowl refugees being turned away at state borders, forced to live in tent camps without running water or adequate food. The economics of staying versus leaving create impossible calculations. Your farm is worthless. No one wants to buy drought-stricken land covered in drifting sand. But you still owe $200 on the mortgage money you'll never earn from crops that won't grow. The bank has been patient so far, but their patience is wearing thin as more farms default every month. Your livestock are worth almost nothing because everyone is trying to sell at the same time. Yesterday, you saw a neighbor sell a prize bull that cost him $200 in 1930 for $15 and a handshake. The social fabric of rural communities is unraveling in ways that feel almost biblical. The schoolhouse, where your children learn to read, has been closed since spring because too many families have left and there's no money to pay the teacher. The general store that served as the community's social center shuttered last month when its owner, Carl Peterson, loaded his family into a Chevrolet and headed for Oregon without telling anyone goodbye. Even the churches are struggling as congregations dwindle and collection plates come up empty week after week. Historians still argue whether the Dust Bowl exodus was primarily driven by environmental disaster or economic collapse. The truth is that the two forces fed each other in a vicious cycle that made recovery impossible. Crop failures led to bank failures, which led to business closures, which led to unemployment, which led to more families leaving, which led to further economic decline. By 1935, entire counties in Oklahoma and Texas had lost over half their population. The migration patterns emerging from the Dust Bowl follow the same routes that cattle drives used 60 years earlier, but instead of moving livestock, these highways are carrying human cargo. Route 66 has become known as the Mother Road, packed with overloaded vehicles heading west toward California, Arizona, and Oregon. Gas stations along the route report selling more oil than gasoline because these ancient trucks are burning through their engines trying to haul impossible loads across desert mountains. Your neighbor Pete Kowalski represents the other side of the great decision. He's decided to stay no matter what, even though his wife left with the children last spring. This land has been good to my family, he tells you over coffee in his kitchen, which is lit by kerosene lamps because the electricity was shut off for non-payment 3 months ago. I'm not going to run away just because we're having a few bad years. Pete has started trapping jackrabbits for food and burning cow chips for fuel living like a pioneer from 50 years ago. The most heartbreaking aspect of the exodus is watching families split apart over the decision. You know couples who've divorced because one spouse refused to leave while the other couldn't bear to stay. Children are being sent ahead to relatives in other states while parents try to settle their affairs, not knowing when or if they'll be reunited. The traditional extended family networks that held rural communities together for generations are being scattered across the continent like dust in the wind. The practical logistics of leaving everything behind would be challenging under normal circumstances, but the drought has made even basic preparation nearly impossible. Used cars are scarce and expensive because everyone wants to buy one at the same time. Gasoline costs more than many families can afford, especially when they need to carry enough fuel to cross deserts where gas stations are hundreds of miles apart. Water is even more precious. Smart travelers carry spare radiator water and drinking water, adding weight that their overloaded vehicles can barely handle. The stories filtering back from those who've already left paint a complex picture of what awaits refugees in their destination states. Some letters describe successful new lives jobs in aircraft factories, children thriving in California, schools steady paychecks for the first time in years. But other reports are grim tent camps without sanitation exploitation by employers who pay below subsistence wages, hostility from local residents who view the newcomers as unwanted competition for scarce jobs. California has become the promised land in the imaginations of desperate farm families, but the reality is more complicated. The state's agricultural valleys do need seasonal workers, but they need them for a few weeks during harvest season, not year-round employment for entire families. The myth of unlimited opportunity in California is being promoted by labor contractors who benefit from having more workers than jobs, knowing that desperate people will accept almost any wage. Your wife has started packing, quietly folding clothes and wrapping dishes in newspaper, even though you haven't officially decided to leave. She's seen too many neighbors wait too long and end up traveling in winter weather with inadequate supplies. If we're going to go, she tells you, we need to go while we still have enough money for gasoline and food for the trip. Her practicality cuts through your emotional attachment to the land that's been in your family for 2 generations. The final straw comes when your youngest daughter develops the persistent cough that everyone recognizes as the early stage of dust pneumonia. The doctor, one of the few professional people left in town, tells you bluntly that she needs to breathe clean air or she might not survive another winter. Looking at your child's pale face and listening to her struggle to breathe, the choice suddenly becomes simple. Tomorrow morning, you'll join the river of refugees flowing west on Highway 66, carrying everything you own and leaving behind everything you've ever known. You're sitting in a government office in Dodge City, Kansas, listening to a man in a 3-piece suit explain his plan to save your farm by covering it with concrete. The year is 1935, and the federal government has finally acknowledged that the Dust Bowl represents a national emergency requiring unprecedented intervention. Unfortunately, some of the proposed solutions are almost as catastrophic as the original problem, and you're about to witness American ingenuity at its most desperately creative and spectacularly misguided. The concrete proposal comes from a consortium of cement manufacturers who've convinced themselves, and apparently some government officials, that the solution to soil erosion is to eliminate soil entirely. Their plan involves covering millions of acres of farmland with a thin layer of concrete, perforated with holes every few inches, allowing crops to grow through the openings while preventing the underlying soil from blowing away. The cost estimate runs into the hundreds of millions of dollars, roughly equivalent to the entire federal budget for agriculture, but the contractors assure everyone that the investment will pay for itself within a decade. You politely decline the concrete option and walk outside to find another government representative explaining an equally ambitious scheme to a group of skeptical farmers. This one involves covering the entire southern Great Plains with chicken wire stretched between telephone poles, creating a vast net that would theoretically hold the topsoil in place during windstorms. The logistics of installing millions of miles of wire across open prairie would require mobilizing an army of workers, but the plan's supporters argue that the Civilian Conservation Corps needs projects anyway, so why not kill two birds with one stone? The most grandiose scheme of all comes from a team of meteorologists and engineers who proposed seeding clouds with silver iodide to artificially induce rainfall across the drought-stricken region. This early experiment in weather modification involves flying airplanes through storm systems and releasing chemicals designed to encourage cloud formation and precipitation. The scientific basis for cloud seeding is actually sound, though the technology won't be perfected for another 20 years, and the current attempts produce results that are sporadic at best and possibly counterproductive at worst. Historians still argue whether these elaborate government intervention schemes represented visionary thinking ahead of their time or desperate flailing by officials who had no idea how to address an unprecedented environmental crisis. The truth is probably both. Some of the ideas contained kernels of genuine innovation, while others were obviously products of panic and political pressure to do something, regardless of whether that something made sense. The most successful government program turns out to be the simplest, hiring young men to plant trees. The Civilian Conservation Corps, created as part of President Roosevelt's New Deal to address unemployment during the Great Depression, has mobilized thousands of workers to establish what they're calling the Great Plains Shelter Belt. The plan calls for planting 220 million trees in a zone stretching from Canada to Texas, creating windbreaks that will reduce soil erosion and modify local weather patterns. You watch crews of CCC workers arrive in your county like a dusty army of environmental soldiers. Most of these young men are from eastern cities and have never seen prairie landscape before, but they adapt quickly to the harsh conditions. They live in temporary camps that spring up across the region, working dawn to dusk, planting saplings in carefully surveyed rows designed to provide maximum wind protection for the farmland behind them. The pay is minimal, $30 a month, but plus room and board. But for unemployed young men during the Great Depression, it represents steady work and 3 meals a day. The tree planting operation faces challenges that would discourage less determined organizers. Many of the saplings die immediately upon planting because there's simply not enough groundwater to sustain them during the ongoing drought. The workers develop ingenious irrigation systems using diverted creek water and recycled gray water from their camps, but survival rates remain discouragingly low. Some sections require replanting 3 or 4 times before any trees successfully establish themselves. Your neighbor Pete has signed up to participate in another government program that pays farmers to implement soil conservation practices on their land. This involves techniques like contour plowing, following the natural elevation lines of the land instead of plowing in straight rows and terracing steep slopes to prevent water runoff. The practices are based on solid scientific principles developed by soil scientist Hugh Bennett, who's become something of a celebrity in agricultural circles for his innovative approaches to erosion control. The government has also launched an ambitious campaign to convince farmers to adopt what they call dry farming techniques, specifically designed for arid regions. Instead of trying to grow crops that require abundant moisture, the extension agents recommend drought-resistant varieties of wheat and sorghum that can survive on minimal rainfall. They're also promoting the practice of leaving crop stubble in fields over winter instead of clearing it away, providing natural wind protection for the soil beneath. Some of the more radical proposals involve completely abandoning agriculture in the most severely damaged areas and returning the land to its natural prairie state. The Resettlement Administration, another New Deal agency, is actually purchasing failed farms and relocating the families to more sustainable agricultural regions. The abandoned farmland will theoretically be replanted with native grasses and managed as public grazing land, though the logistics of such a massive restoration project remain unclear. The strangest government initiative involves hiring unemployed writers and photographers to document the Dust Bowl experience for posterity. The Farm Security Administration has dispatched teams of artists across the drought-stricken region to create what they call a visual record of American agricultural crisis. These photographers, including future legends like Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans, are capturing images that will become iconic representations of Depression-era hardship, though their immediate practical value for solving the dust problem remains questionable. Your wife Martha finds the whole parade of government experts and their competing solutions both amusing and frustrating. If they'd spent half this energy teaching people about soil conservation before we plowed up the prairie, she observes, we might not need concrete farms and chicken wire blankets. Her point is well taken. Most of the current crisis could have been prevented with the knowledge and techniques that existed before the Great Plow-Up of the 1920s. But economic incentives encouraged maximum production rather than sustainable practices. The most promising development comes from an unexpected source, local farmers who've started experimenting with their own solutions. Your neighbor Tom has developed a technique for creating artificial windbreaks using old bed sheets and fence posts, providing temporary protection for young crops during the worst dust storms. Other farmers are sharing information about drought-resistant crop varieties and water conservation methods through informal networks that prove more effective than official government programs. As you watch yet another team of government experts drive away after explaining their latest scheme, something involving giant fans to blow the dust storms back where they came from, you realize that recovery will ultimately depend less on elaborate federal interventions and more on the accumulated wisdom of people who've learned to work with the land instead of against it. You're standing in a newly terraced field with Hugh Bennett, the man they're calling the father of soil conservation, watching him demonstrate something that seems almost magical: water flowing across plowed ground without carrying away a single grain of topsoil. It's the spring of 1936, and Bennett has traveled from Washington, D.C. to your corner of Kansas because he believes that science, not concrete or chicken wire, holds the key to healing the wounded Great Plains. Bennett's approach to farming represents a complete philosophical shift from everything you learned growing up. Instead of fighting against the natural characteristics of prairie land, his techniques work with the existing topography and climate patterns. The terraces he's helped you construct follow the natural contour lines of your fields, creating a series of gentle steps that slow water runoff and allow precipitation to soak into the soil instead of rushing away and taking your topsoil with it. The science behind contour farming isn't particularly complex, but it requires abandoning decades of conventional wisdom about straight row planting. Bennett shows you how water behaves differently when it encounters obstacles placed perpendicular to its natural flow path. Instead of gathering speed and erosive force as it runs downhill, the water pools temporarily behind each contour line, giving it time to infiltrate the soil and nourish your crops instead of destroying them. You're learning to read your land like a topographical map, identifying subtle elevation changes that were invisible to you before. Bennett has taught you to use a simple A-frame level, a device that looks like a wooden triangle with a plumb line hanging from its peak to trace the contour lines across your fields. Following these invisible elevation guides, you plow curves instead of straight lines, creating farming patterns that look almost organic when viewed from a distance. The strip cropping technique Bennett advocates represents another radical departure from traditional Great Plains agriculture. Instead of planting entire fields to a single crop, you're now alternating strips of wheat with strips of drought-resistant grass or legumes. The grass strips act as natural windbreaks, protecting the wheat from soil-eroding winds, while the legumes add nitrogen to the soil through their root systems. The result is a patchwork landscape that looks chaotic to untrained eyes, but follows precise scientific principles. Historians still argue whether the soil conservation practices pioneered during the Dust Bowl era were truly revolutionary or simply applications of techniques that had been developed elsewhere and ignored by American farmers focused on maximum short-term production. Bennett himself admits that many of his innovations are based on farming methods used successfully in other arid regions around the world, but the political and economic incentives of 1920s America discouraged their adoption until crisis made change inevitable. The most challenging aspect of implementing these new techniques is overcoming the social pressure to conform to traditional farming practices. Your neighbors watch you plowing curved furrows and shake their heads, convinced that you've lost your mind along with your topsoil. Some of the older farmers openly mock Bennett's methods, calling them fancy Eastern ideas that won't work on real prairie land. The peer pressure to abandon these experiments becomes intense when your first attempts produce mixed results. Bennett's most important insight concerns the relationship between crop residue and soil protection. Traditional farming wisdom called for clearing fields completely after harvest, leaving them clean for the next growing season. Bennett demonstrates that crop stubble left standing over winter provides crucial protection against wind erosion, acting like millions of tiny anchors holding the soil in place. The practice requires fighting against aesthetic preferences. Stubble fields look messy and unkempt, but the practical benefits become undeniable once you see them in action. You're also learning about the complex underground ecology that supports healthy soil. Bennett explains how mycorrhizal fungi form symbiotic relationships with plant roots, creating underground networks that help crops access nutrients and water more efficiently. These fungal partnerships, invisible to the naked eye, are destroyed by excessive plowing and chemical applications, but can be encouraged through careful soil management. The science feels almost mystical, but the results speak for themselves in improved crop yields and reduced erosion. The introduction of cover crops represents another fundamental change in Great Plains agriculture. Instead of leaving fields fallow during off-seasons, Bennett advocates planting soil-improving crops like sweet clover or winter rye that don't compete with your cash crops, but protect and enrich the soil year-round. These cover crops require additional seed costs and labor, but they pay for themselves through reduced fertilizer needs and improved soil structure. Bennett's workshops on pasture management reveal how even livestock grazing can be managed to improve rather than degrade prairie ecosystems. Rotational grazing moving cattle frequently between small paddocks instead of allowing them continuous access to large pastures mimics the natural grazing patterns of bison herds that helped maintain prairie health for thousands of years. The technique requires more labor and better fencing, but it results in improved grass production and reduced soil compaction. The most sophisticated conservation technique Bennett teaches involves creating what he calls living snow fences, carefully planned rows of trees and shrubs that capture blowing snow and reduce wind speeds across vulnerable fields. These biological windbreaks take years to establish and require species selection based on local climate conditions, but they provide permanent protection that manufactured windbreaks can't match. The trees also create microclimates that modify local temperature and humidity patterns, making your fields more resilient to drought conditions. Your wife Martha has become equally enthusiastic about Bennett's techniques for managing household water resources. She's learned to capture and store rainwater from roof gutters, create gray water systems that reuse washing water for gardens, and select drought-tolerant vegetables that require minimal irrigation. These domestic conservation practices complement the field techniques, creating an integrated approach to living sustainably in an arid environment. The economic benefits of soil conservation practices become apparent gradually but inevitably. Your fuel costs decrease because you're making fewer passes across the field with heavy equipment. Your seed costs drop because improved soil conditions result in better germination rates. Most importantly, your yields become more consistent from year to year because healthy soil buffers against both drought and excessive moisture. As you walk across your transformed farm with Bennett examining the early results of 2 years' worth of conservation work, you realize that you're not just learning new farming techniques, you're developing a completely different relationship with the land. Instead of viewing your farm as a factory for extracting maximum short-term profit, you're beginning to see it as a complex ecosystem that requires careful stewardship to remain productive over the long term. You're standing in your kitchen garden on a morning in late September 1939, watching your wife Martha harvest tomatoes that are actually growing in soil instead of sand, and for the first time in nearly a decade, you dare to feel optimistic about the future. The rains returned last spring, not the torrential downpours that would create their own problems, but the gentle, steady precipitation that prairie ecosystems need to heal. The sky overhead is a clean blue that you'd almost forgotten existed, unmarked by the brown smudges that dominated your horizons throughout the terrible 30s. The transformation of your landscape feels almost supernatural after so many years of drought and devastation. The terraces you built under Hugh Bennett's guidance are working exactly as promised, channeling precious rainwater into your soil instead of letting it run off and carry away your topsoil. The contour strips of wheat and grass create a patchwork pattern across your fields that looks intentional and beautiful rather than desperate and makeshift. Even your neighbors, who initially mocked these fancy Eastern ideas, are quietly implementing similar practices on their own farms. Your shelter belt trees planted by CCC workers 4 years ago have finally grown tall enough to provide meaningful wind protection. The cottonwoods and Chinese elms form green barriers that break the force of prairie winds, creating microclimates where more delicate crops can flourish. Walking through these young groves feels like entering a different world, cooler, more humid, alive with birdsong from species that had abandoned the region during the worst years of the dust storms. The most remarkable change is psychological rather than physical. Your family has learned to live without the constant anxiety that dominated the Dust Bowl years. Your children no longer wake up coughing from overnight dust infiltration. Your wife doesn't automatically check the western horizon for approaching storms when she steps outside. The simple act of hanging laundry to dry has become a pleasure rather than a gamble against the weather. But recovery remains fragile and incomplete. Many of your neighbors never returned from their migrations west, leaving behind empty farmhouses that serve as reminders of communities that will never be rebuilt. The Hendersons' place stands abandoned, its windows broken and its barn slowly collapsing under the weight of accumulated sand drifts. Entire townships that thrived during the wheat boom of the 1920s have simply vanished, existing now only as place names on old maps and memories in the minds of survivors. The economic recovery lags behind the environmental healing. Crop prices remain depressed because the national economy is still struggling with the effects of the Great Depression. The war in Europe is creating new demand for American agricultural products, but the infrastructure for getting crops to market has been damaged by a decade of economic decline. Many of the grain elevators, banks, and transportation networks that supported Great Plains agriculture have closed permanently. Historians still argue whether the Dust Bowl represented a temporary crisis that has been permanently solved or a preview of environmental challenges that will inevitably return. The soil conservation techniques you've implemented have proven remarkably effective, but they require constant vigilance and maintenance. A single season of careless farming practices could undo years of careful restoration work, and the economic pressures that drove the original prairie destruction remain largely unchanged. The most troubling long-term issue is water. The successful restoration of many Dust Bowl farms has been achieved through increased irrigation from underground aquifers, particularly the massive Ogallala Aquifer that stretches from South Dakota to Texas. But groundwater mining isn't sustainable indefinitely. Government hydrologists warn that current pumping rates will exhaust these aquifers within 50 to 100 years, potentially creating a water crisis that could make the Dust Bowl look like a minor inconvenience. Your neighbor Pete, who stubbornly remained throughout the worst years, has become something of a local celebrity for his persistence. He's developed an almost mystical understanding of prairie ecology, reading weather patterns and soil conditions with an accuracy that amazes visiting agricultural experts. His success has inspired other farmers to value traditional knowledge alongside scientific innovation, creating a more balanced approach to Great Plains agriculture. The federal government's intervention during the crisis has left a permanent mark on American agricultural policy. The Soil Conservation Service, created in response to the Dust Bowl, continues to provide technical assistance and financial incentives for sustainable farming practices. The precedent of government involvement in agricultural land use has established principles that will influence environmental policy for generations to come. Some of the most important lessons from the Dust Bowl experience concern the relationship between human activity and climate systems. The disaster demonstrated that farming practices can influence local weather patterns, creating feedback loops that either stabilize or destabilize agricultural ecosystems. Your terraces and windbreaks don't just protect your crops, they modify the microclimate around your farm, creating conditions that attract beneficial insects, birds, and soil organisms. The social fabric of Great Plains communities has been permanently altered by the crisis. The traditional self-reliance that characterized frontier culture has been tempered by recognition that environmental challenges require collective action and government support. Rural communities that survive are more tightly knit, but also more dependent on external assistance than their predecessors. The Dust Bowl years have also changed American cultural consciousness in ways that extend far beyond agriculture. The photographs of Dorothea Lange, the writings of John Steinbeck, and the folk songs of Woody Guthrie have made the Great Plains crisis part of national mythology. The disaster has become a symbol of both environmental vulnerability and human resilience, influencing how Americans think about their relationship with the natural world. As you watch the sun set over your restored fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that seem impossibly clean after so many years of dust-stained horizons, you reflect on the larger implications of what you've survived. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a regional agricultural crisis, it was a preview of environmental challenges that will face future generations as human populations grow and climate patterns shift. The techniques you've learned for healing damaged land will prove valuable far beyond the Great Plains. Soil conservation, water management, and sustainable farming practices developed during the Dust Bowl years will be applied to agricultural challenges around the world. The painful lessons of the 1930s have created knowledge that might prevent similar disasters in other regions and other times. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Dust Bowl is humility, the recognition that human beings are not separate from natural systems, but dependent on them. The Prairie taught you that the land is not just a resource to be exploited, but a complex ecosystem that requires respect, understanding, and careful stewardship. That lesson learned through years of suffering and gradual recovery represents wisdom that will serve future generations long after the last Dust Bowl survivor has been forgotten. The seasons change now with a rhythm that feels almost normal, and you find yourself trusting the sky again. Your children are growing up in a world where dust storms are rare memories rather than daily threats, where the horizon holds promise instead of menace. The scars remain in abandoned homesteads, in the memories of those who didn't survive, in the knowledge that this land will always be fragile, but the healing continues one gentle rain at a time. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, in a house that no longer needs to be sealed against the elements, you listen to the soft whisper of wind through your shelter belt trees. It's a sound that speaks of protection, of growth, of lessons learned, and wisdom earned through suffering. The dust has settled both literally and figuratively, and tomorrow The sun will rise over fields that have learned to hold their soil, over communities that have learned to hold together, over a landscape that has been tested by fire and wind and emerged stronger for the trial. The Great Plains endure as they always have, carrying within their vastness the stories of those who tried to tame them and learned instead to live with them. The Dust Bowl years are ending, but their lessons will echo across the generations, reminding future farmers and policymakers that the relationship between human ambition and natural systems must be one of partnership rather than conquest. In the end, the land teaches those who listen, and the price of not listening is measured in billions of tons of topsoil carried away on the prairie wind.